ones that survived, we did get an SOS out to the USS America. Without George Golden, the ship would have sunk. Had it sunk, I assume when debris washed ashore the next day, it would have been blamed on Egypt. There were many, many miracles that day. I shouldn't be here. After watertight integrity had been established and the hatch had been sealed, they reopened it as I floated by. Bud Schnell, went down and pulled me out.
That's where we left off on the last one. You didn't see part one, you need to go back.
Much to my dismay, I personally witnessed the machine gunning of life rafts as they floated by the Israeli torpedo boat crew members, raked the life rafts thoroughly with machine gun fire, making sure that if there had been anyone in the life rafts, they would not have survived.
After the Israeli torpedo blew a huge hole in the Liberty, the last 3 life rafts were put over the side. Israeli torpedo boats sank 2 of those rafts, took the 3rd aboard. We were left with no rafts, nothing that could float.
Damn, sorry, y'all. I'm trying to get that.
Shooting life rafts on a ship in distress is a war crime.
Worst of all is what our government is doing to cover all this whole thing up. When I heard that Johnson, in the heat of the battle, was telling the Admiral Geis of the 6th Fleet that he didn't give a damn. If every man drowned and the ship sinks, he said, I don't give a damn. If every man drowns and the ship sinks, I don't want to embarrass our allies. That made me sort of wonder, with unmarked planes, how did he know it was our allies?
We should have had planes on site 45 minutes into this 2-hour attack, and they never showed. So did Israel apologize and then continue to attack us for an hour and 15 more minutes, or were we being lied to as to the conditions of why they recalled the planes? And because of it, top secret operation of Liberty, and it being the sensitivity of it being Israel, our closest ally, who accidentally attacked the ship, that we are ordered not to grant any interviews. Don't discuss this among yourselves, referring to the attack. Don't get over on the beach drinking in the bars and running your mouth. And he says, in fact, if you go ashore in Malta, you will remove your ship's name from your jersey or go ashore in civilian clothes. Well, another light goes off in my mind. Here's a flag admiral in the middle of the gung-ho 6th Fleet telling enlisted men to go ashore in civilian clothes that we're not even authorized to possess. And he says, so that we won't be singled out and be asked questions about it. And he says, don't discuss the attack among yourselves. Don't write your friends back home about it. He says, in fact, when you get back home, don't even discuss it with your wife and family. And he said quite sternly, just forget it ever happened. And he says that repercussions for violating these orders to silence could result in your court-martial, imprisonment for violating national security, or worse.
I noticed a very large helicopter with Israeli markings hovering very close to us. I looked in the door of the helicopter, which was open, and I could see a number of Israelis carrying automatic weapons. They had just heard that the 6th Fleet had finally launched aircraft to come to our assistance, and so they just left the scene.
Helicopter gunships, I'm sure in my mind, would have picked off survivors if we'd abandoned ship. They were sent there to finish us off.
Yep.
The aircraft were sent to make us incommunicado, so we couldn't send an SOS out. The torpedo boats were sent to sink us, and the helicopters were sent to pick off survivors, so there'd be no choice. It was a perfectly executed military operation. If you look at the photographs of the Liberty after the attack, on the first strafing run, they used heat-seeking missiles that took out the tuning section of every transmitting antenna on the ship. In less than 2 seconds, they had taken out all our communication capability.
The attack on the USS Liberty lasted as long as the attack on Pearl Harbor, about 2 hours. You've heard the outrageous, implausible Israeli version of the attack on Liberty, told by their first-hand observers. You've heard what actually happened, told by the valiant Liberty crew. Now, hear what some of America's greatest heroes and leaders have to say. Colonel Mitchell Page was the last Marine standing after repulsing a Japanese regiment on Guadalcanal.
We all know that this was in international waters. It was an unprovoked, intentional attack on a U.S. vessel with one objective, to sink it and kill all aboard. Unprovoked attack. I think it was dastardly. I think it was a betrayal of any friendship that we may have had with that nation. And I think that it should be exposed to the entire world and all brought out so that the whole world would know the actual truth about that particular day in 1967.
And very widely you could see this was an American ship. And not only did the Israelis attack it, they did this with their Army, Navy, and Air Force.
Kennedy in 68.
Though badly wounded, Navy Master Chief Bob Bush held off a Japanese advance while saving his commanding officer's life.
You know, it's impossible for me to figure out why maybe I would sit here and attack you when we're friends. I mean, they're getting our money to buy those French airplanes. And then they turn around and attack our ship when they can see that it's our ship. It's absolutely uncalled for.
Army Colonel Lou Millett led the last bayonet charge against vastly superior Chinese forces in Korea.
I was in World War II. I studied all the different types of aircraft so that when I shot at a plane, I'd make sure I was shooting at the enemy and not out. They know what those ships look like, and if they don't, I can't conceive that they don't know. I do know this. It was a criminal act. It was an act of war. It's as bad as Vietnam, allowing people who were trying to save people from tyranny to die for nothing.
Admiral Thomas Morter is the longest-serving active four-star admiral in American history. He is the only American admiral to have commanded both the Atlantic and Pacific fleets. He was head of NATO forces, served as Chief of Naval Operations, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for 2 terms. The Navy's chief fighter, the F-14 Tomcat, was named after Admiral Tom Morter.
The question is, if the Israelis thought the frequencies they jammed were in fact broadcast by the Egyptian ship, why did they jam the American frequencies? There's no question about the fact that the jamming of the Liberty frequencies was deliberate and was undoubtedly ordered by high authority. Since a large part of the crashes were caused by torpedo boats, could have been prevented from making those attacks by the aircraft that were on their way to help when they were recalled.
Admiral Arleigh Burke was known as Mr. Navy. His long and illustrious career was capped by him becoming the Chief of Naval Operations. The high-tech modern American Navy destroyers were named the Arleigh E. Burke class of destroyer.
I don't know yet why we didn't protect that ship. I don't know why the Israelis would take such terrific chances. It must have been something that was very important to them to decide to attack without considering the probability of war.
Recuperating from serious throat surgery, the Saratoga skipper, Joe Tully, spoke about the launch and recall of protective aircraft.
They had launched ready at that time 12 aircraft, conventionally armed, and I immediately launched. And to my surprise, the Americans did not launch. About the same time, a message came from Rear Admiral Larry Geist, who was the Carrier Division commander, and who was not the officer in tactical command, but who was senior to me, who had somehow been given tactical command or assumed it, ordering the strike aircraft to return to Saratoga.
And it was the first time that the hotline, the red line between Washington and Moscow, had been activated. And the message from the United States to Chairman Kosygin at the time was, advise General Nasser that the American planes are going to be launched to determine what the status of the Liberty was.
I have spent a large part of my life flying over the oceans and identifying ships. And this ship was perhaps the easiest ship to identify that was listed in the United States Navy. Equipped with antenna from bow to stern, pointing in every direction. It reminds one of a large, vigorous lobster. And a look that made it extremely easy to recognize.
Robert Joseph Kelly is a retired United States Navy
So I will never buy the idea that the pilots thought this was some other ship.
And it appeared from the ferocity of the attack that the intent of the attackers was to sink the ship. Maybe they hoped to have no survivors so that they would not be held accountable for the attack after it occurred.
We didn't know who was attacking us. They didn't know who was attacking us. I don't know how Washington can say, don't go, because they're friends of ours. So that's the thing that's always bothered me right there.
I never myself accepted the Israeli purported explanation. Accidents don't occur through repeated attacks by surface vessels and by aircraft. It obviously was a decision taken pretty high up on the Israeli side because it involved combined forces. The ship was flying an American flag. Even if it had been unidentified from an Israeli point of view, it was a reckless thing for them to do. Suppose it had been a Soviet ship. In fact, it produced very large problems indeed.
George Ball, the brilliant and courageous Undersecretary of State at the time of the '67 war, wrote about the attack on the Liberty subsequently. He said, "The ultimate lesson of the Liberty attack was that it had far more effect on policy in Israel than in America. Israel's leaders concluded that nothing they might do would offend the Americans to the point of reprisal. If America's leaders did not have the courage to punish Israel for the blatant murder of American citizens, it seemed clear that their American friends would let them get away with almost anything."
The fleet tug Papago would be our escort into Malta. The divers rigged a large canvas over the torpedo hull. It was secured in place using ropes that were passed under the hull and over the main deck. Once the canvas was in place, the Liberty could proceed under its own power towards Malta. Once we were in dry dock in Malta, then came the gruesome task of removing the bodies and the debris from the research vessels. I was unfortunate enough to draw the first shift as part of our division, which would be used to cut the debris away from the bodies so they could be removed from the research spaces. The first body to come out was almost unrecognizable. Due to being in salt water for 6 days, the body was almost completely hairless. We fingerprinted the body, put it in a body bag, and moved it out of the spaces. This continued through the night and on into the next day. After 33 days in Malta and the Liberty was repaired, we brought the ship back to Norfolk. Now it was over. The Liberty was home. Over. It will never be over until the truth is known.
That's how we feel about that slavery.
The report of the casualties. The first word that we get out was before the torpedo attack that we had 9 dead and 75 wounded. This has been the number that has almost invariably appeared in the newspapers as an attempt to minimize the nature of the attack, the ferocity of the attack, and the unjustifiable nature of the attack.
There was no press campaign to cover this in its entirety for the benefit of the American people. As a matter of fact, in many cases, the press supported the Israeli campaign.
Future Judge Advocate General of the Navy, Rear Admiral Merlin Starring, was given less than 24 hours to review the 600-page Court of Inquiry report.
In the course of my career as a Navy lawyer, I have been called upon to review and take actions upon hundreds of investigations of various degrees of importance and volume. This is the only instance in which a record of such an investigation has been withdrawn from me after I had been asked to review it and had not been given an opportunity to complete my advice to the committing authority. As you know, it's a voluminous document. And one of the things that I initially had difficulty with, and still do, is the fact that the very first statement of fact that the court arrived at and presented was this: available evidence combines to indicate the attack on Liberty on 8 June was in fact a case of mistaken identity. Now that is the sort of thing in this record that I found great difficulty in supporting from the evidence that was included. I'm convinced that it was withdrawn from me in this instance because of my statement to Captain Boston that I was having serious problems with the evidence that was available to support the statements of fact.
In the subsequent cover-up, the Israelis maintained that they thought the Liberty was the small Egyptian freighter, the Al-Qusayr. This is not credible. Not only was the Liberty flying a large American flag, but it was 5 times as large as the Al-Qusayr, and its profile was unique. It bore no resemblance whatsoever to the Egyptian ship.
Tordella was the deputy director at the time of the attack. Tordella, when he received the copy of the Israeli mistake explanation, wrote across the top of it a nice whitewash. He didn't believe it at all. And he later wrote another memorandum for the record indicating that he thought that the most likely explanation was that the Israelis attacked the Liberty because they didn't want the Liberty to hear what was going on in the Sinai. And this is the highest professional at NSA. In addition, the director of NSA at the time, Marshall Carter, told me that he thought it was deliberate. In addition to that, he was very offended in another memorandum he wrote that it appeared that the Johnson administration wanted to cover up the whole thing. They actually wanted to sink the ship so that Israel wouldn't be embarrassed.
Admiral Kidd, when he came aboard our ship to interview the survivors, he got us in small groups, 3 or 4 or 5 sailors, and he would ask us questions. The first thing he did is he took off his stars, laid them on the table, and say, "Listen, open up to me and talk to me just like her. I'm just like you, one of you." So we did. We trusted him. We opened up with our hearts. We told him exactly the way we felt, what happened, what we saw. And when that was done, he put his stars back on his lapel, and he ordered us not to say anything to anybody, our families, friends, shipmates, anyone. If we did, we faced the possibility of a court-martial, penitentiary, or worse. And everyone knew what worse meant. Actually, he scared the death out of me. I didn't talk about the attack to anyone for almost 20 years.
Not knowing why they did this and not having our government back us then and now. It's an open sore. It's festering to this day. It's not going away.
I think it's important that we do have an investigation. I would never give up on that until I'm too old to come to these things. It needs to be done. And Pete Bucher from the Pueblo said he wouldn't even have gone if he could have known what really happened to us. All he knew was some piddly little thing he heard about on the news.
In late 1991, Dwight Porter, who was ambassador to Lebanon during the 1967 war, told columnists Evans and Novak that immediately after the attack on the Liberty, the CIA station chief handed him intercepted messages between the Israeli war room and their planes. The pilots were given orders to attack the ship, and they replied immediately that it was an American ship. The Israeli headquarters responded, "You have your orders, attack the ship." The pilots tried once again, "But it's an American ship. We can see its flag." And headquarters insisted, "You have your orders, attack it." And attack it they did, and the consequences are well known.
So one of the things I found out was that that had never been discovered before was the fact that at the time the Liberty was attacked, the NSA also had an eavesdropping plane flying high above the scene of the action. It was an EC-121, and during the entire course of the war, the U.S. Had eavesdropping planes going over the area, collecting signals, eavesdropping on what was going on below. And this plane was flying right over the scene of the attack. And I talked to two of the crew members of the plane, and both of them agreed that what they heard were comments from both the pilots and the torpedo boat personnel mentioning the U.S. flag. Now that flies in the face of what the Israeli explanation says. The Israeli explanation says nobody on either the planes or the ships ever saw a U.S. flag.
Evans and Novak got further confirmation of the Israeli attack from an American-born Israeli major, Seth Mintz, who was in the Israeli war room at the time of the attack. He told the reporters, quote, "Everyone felt that it was an American ship and that it was the Liberty. There were comments about the markings, about the flag. Everybody in the room was convinced it was an American ship," unquote.
I hope you're not bored.
But the American suppression of the truth was an equal outrage.
Well, at the time, the Liberty was off the coast of the Sinai, off the coast of where El Arish was on the Sinai Peninsula. According to Israeli military historians who wrote reports of it at the time, and other eyewitnesses, the Israeli military was killing prisoners, Egyptian prisoners, committing war crimes, desperate acts of war crimes in order to, so they wouldn't have to transport the prisoners because they had no place to put the prisoners. They decided to take the most expedient method and just kill them.
If the planes dispatched by the Saratoga had continued to the rescue, the Israelis would have been driven off. But Washington took the Israelis at their word. They said they had recognized their error and they apologized. And the attack had already stopped, they said, but they were lying. The attack continued for another hour and 20 minutes, during which 25 more American sailors died and 110 more were wounded. All would have been spared if the American planes sent to help them had not been recalled by Washington.
The point was, the attack did take place. There were a lot of reasons that the Israelis would have wanted to hide things from the U.S., and that's why there is a need for investigation. I mean, you're not going to take the word of somebody who was the principal person who caused it. That'd be like taking the word of a defendant in a shooting.
Every one of the 1,000-odd clashes between Syria and Israel between 1948 and 1967 was examined by the UN Truth Supervisory Commission, which found out that only a very, very few had been caused by the Syrians. A few dozen of the clashes were ambiguous, and all of the rest were caused by Israel. Well, there were many officers of many nations, and they all reported the same thing. Could they all have been lying? Still, we no longer have to rely only on the UN documentation. Moshe Dayan, who commanded the Israeli forces in 1967 and had given the order to occupy the Golan, gave an interview to an Israeli journalist in 1976. The The interview was kept secret until April 1997, when it was published in an Israeli newspaper. It has been authenticated by Israeli historians, and General Dayan's daughter, Yael, a member of the Knesset, insisted that it be published. Why did he give the order to invade? Essentially, it was because of pressure from the would-be settlers in Golan, who convinced Levi Eshkol, the Israeli prime minister, to occupy the heights and the fertile lands beyond. And when asked if that were all there was to it, Dayan replied, "I can tell you with absolute confidence that they were not thinking about security. They were thinking about the heights land. I saw them. I spoke with them. They didn't even try to hide their greed for that land."
The best one is the one where they wanted to go on Heights. And Johnson said, "That's enough, that's enough." And they needed another day to get the Golan Heights, which they still have, which I didn't think you were supposed to do, take land from another country and keep it.
If we could get the truth of the Liberty out, that it would change history, I think, in this country.
I cannot, absolutely can't see why our American newspapers and TV people have helped to cover this up, but not covering some of our stories.
The Navy Board of Inquiry would not admit testimony about the jamming, the recall, the unmarked planes, the shooting of life rafts, and other material that we tried to present. They asked questions. We were allowed to answer those questions, period.
They put me into a ward with 12 to 13 other patients, and within 30 minutes they removed me from that ward and put me into a single room. I noticed that I had a name tag with Smith on, and right after I noticed that, an officer came in and told me that from now on my name is Smith. I was never on the Liberty, and I was never ever to talk about it to anyone. I still have 53 pieces of shrapnel in me today.
Never before has the U.S. Navy ignored eyewitness testimony of American military to accept on faith the story told by their attackers.
Certain entries in the ship's log of June 8th have raised serious questions.
Nobody knew who was wounded or how severely.
This had not been established until days after reaching Malta. The log also minimized the duration of the attack by over an hour and a half, conveniently fitting the Israeli version. It then documented the number of wounded not as the actual 172, but at the widely published media figure of 75.
It should be a congressional committee, both Senate and House, to examine all the data available. And it's getting late to do this because, like my uncle, God bless his soul, is gone.
I know that Bill was on board the USS Liberty, and the ship was off the coast at Gaza Strip, as I recall, and yet our government put it in writing in the United States Senate book of Congressional Medal of Honor recipients that he received his medal for action in Vietnam. Now, to me, that is one of the worst cover-ups in American history. How low can our government go?
And it's something that I'd like to see totally investigated and a closure of this issue, because I think President Johnson was the villain on it. I think he recalled the people that were to defend the ship.
I have never accepted the explanation, and so far as I'm concerned, the affair of the USS Liberty remains a scar on the relations between Israel and the United States.
Things like this don't happen. Things are